The moment the van parked in front of my house, I stopped whispering to the 911 dispatcher because I realized they probably already knew I was watching them. This happened back in 2016 when I was 25 and living alone in a suburb outside Denver. At the time, I worked late remote shifts for a customer support company based in another state, so my sleep schedule was completely backwards. Most nights I'd still be awake around 2 in the morning with my office light on and headphones around my neck while the entire neighborhood was dark. The street I lived on was one of those quiet suburban areas where nothing really happened. Mostly older couples, a few families, and the same cars parked in the same driveways every night. The house directly across from mine belonged to an older couple who traveled a lot. I barely knew them, but I knew they were gone because their SUV had been missing for almost a week, and the house had been completely dark every night. The only reason I even paid attention to their house in the first place was because I spent so many nights staring out that same front window while taking calls or trying to stay awake during shifts. That night, right around 2 a.m., I got up from my desk to heat up leftovers in the kitchen when I noticed light coming from across the street. At first, I assumed they'd come back early, but something looked off immediately. The garage door was halfway open, and there was a white van backed into the driveway, at an angle like the driver had parked in a hurry. I stood there for a few seconds watching through the blinds. One guy walked out through the side garage door, carrying a plastic storage bin with both hands, moving calmly without rushing or even looking around. He just walked straight to the van and slid the bin inside. A second guy came out behind him, carrying what looked like a flat-screen monitor. I remember still trying to convince myself there was a normal explanation for it, because the way they were moving didn't match what you expect from a burglary. They looked organized, calm, like they'd done this before. Then I noticed there were no other cars outside the house. There was no SUV in the driveway, and every other room in the house was completely dark. That was when I picked up my phone and called 911. I kept my voice low while I watched from the front window. The dispatcher started asking questions, and while I was answering, I noticed a third person sitting inside the van behind the wheel. He wasn't helping move anything. He was just watching the street through the windshield. The second I noticed him, I felt the situation change. The other two kept going in and out of the house, while the driver barely moved his head. Every once in a while, he'd glance toward different houses on the block, like he was checking who was awake. I turned off the light in my office and moved farther away from the window. I didn't want them seeing me standing there staring at them while I was on the phone with police. The dispatcher told me officers were already heading over, but the nearest patrol car was apparently several minutes away. While she was talking, I made the mistake of peeking through the blinds again. One of the guys outside suddenly stopped walking. He looked directly at my house. I instinctively lowered myself a little, still holding the phone against my ear, and even from across the street, I could tell he was staring at the exact window I was behind. He stayed there for maybe 3 or 4 seconds before saying something toward the van. Then all 3 of them stopped moving. The dispatcher was still talking, asking if they were armed, but I stopped answering because the van had just started rolling backward out of the driveway. It pulled across the street and parked directly in front of my house. I remember crouching lower near the window, because at that point I genuinely thought they were trying to figure out which house had called the police. The engine stayed running, but nobody got out for several seconds. Then the passenger door opened. One of the guys stepped onto the street and started walking slowly toward my driveway. I backed away from the window and moved through the house without turning on any lights. The dispatcher kept telling me officers were close, but my entire focus was on the sound outside. I heard my gate rattle once from the side yard, then footsteps near my car. The guy outside wasn't trying to break in. That almost made it worse. He was checking things, looking around quietly. A few seconds later, someone knocked on my front door. I didn't move. Nobody spoke. Nobody knocked again. I stayed crouched near the hallway, listening to the dispatcher talk, while the guy outside stood there long enough that I started wondering if he could hear me breathing through the door. Then I heard another sound from the side of the house. At first I thought it was one of the officers arriving, but then I realized it was coming from my backyard gate. The metal latch scraped against the fence, followed by footsteps moving across the concrete patio behind the house. There were at least 2 of them outside now. I remember muting my microphone at one point during the call because I thought they might hear the dispatcher talking through my phone speaker. My house suddenly felt way smaller than it normally did. Every room had windows facing either the street or the backyard, and I kept thinking about how exposed everything was if they decided to actually come inside. The dispatcher asked if I could safely stay hidden upstairs, but the second floor overlooked the front yard completely. If I moved up there and looked out any window, they'd probably see me immediately. Then my motion light in the backyard turned on. I couldn't see the yard itself from where I was standing, but I could see the light reflecting faintly through the kitchen doorway. A few seconds later, it switched off again. I still remember how everything outside suddenly went quiet after that, like they'd stopped moving all at once. What bothered me was that I couldn't tell where any of them were anymore. I stayed crouched near the hallway for what felt like forever before I finally heard somebody walk back across the front porch. The wood creaked once near the steps, then I heard the van door shut. A second later, another knock hit the front door. This time harder. Not aggressive, just enough to let me know they were still there. I gripped my phone so hard my hand started cramping, while the dispatcher kept telling me officers were pulling into the neighborhood. The second she said that, I saw flashing lights reflect across my living room wall. The van pulled away almost immediately. Tires squealed for maybe half a second before it disappeared down the street without headlights. Police arrived less than a minute later. By then, the house across from mine had already been cleaned out. The older couple came back the next morning, and the police confirmed the house had been robbed. What still bothers me is that the van could have left the neighborhood immediately, but instead it crossed the street and stopped directly in front of my house. The first time I realized something was wrong with him was when he grabbed my wrist in front of my wife and kids and held it just long enough to make sure I understood it wasn't accidental. My wife and I were setting up a garage sale early on a Saturday morning when he walked up our driveway before we had even finished unloading boxes from the garage. We were living in a suburb outside Columbus and getting ready to move, so most of the stuff outside was random junk we didn't want to take with us. The guy looked normal enough at first. He gave a small nod when my wife mentioned we weren't fully set up, and started walking around the driveway while we kept unpacking things. What stood out immediately was that he barely looked at the tables. Most garage sale people either rush toward things they want or ask prices right away. This guy kept looking past everything, into the garage, toward the side gate. At one point, my daughter came outside carrying a small box of toys. and I noticed him watching her walk from the house to the driveway before looking back toward the open front door. I remember telling myself not to overthink it because we had invited strangers onto the property ourselves. Still, the longer he stayed there, the more uncomfortable it got. Eventually, he picked up an old power drill from one of the tables and asked if it worked. I told him it did, expecting that to be the end of the conversation. But instead, he started asking questions that had nothing to do with the drill. He asked if we were moving far, if the house had sold already, and if we'd already moved most of our stuff out. I gave vague answers and tried to move the conversation along, but he kept going. He asked if we were leaving that weekend and whether the garage stayed locked from inside the house. That was the point where my wife looked over at me because she could tell something felt off too. The guy wasn't aggressive or acting crazy. Honestly, that was part of what made him unsettling. He sounded calm the entire time, almost casual, like he was asking normal neighbor questions. A few more people arrived after that, and for a while I lost track of him while helping another guy load a treadmill into his truck. When I turned around again, the man was standing near the open garage, looking toward the shelves in the back and the door leading into the house. I walked over and told him the sale items were outside and that nothing inside the garage was for sale. He looked at me for a second without saying anything. I told him again, more directly this time, that he needed to stay out of the garage. That was when he stepped closer and held the drill out toward me like he was handing it back. The second I reached for it, his other hand grabbed my wrist hard enough that I felt it immediately. He didn't yell or threaten me. He just held my wrist tighter and tighter while staring directly at me until everyone nearby went quiet. My wife was standing in the driveway watching us. Both of my kids were on the porch. I remember hearing somebody across the street loading things into a car while this guy stood there squeezing my wrist like he was trying to see whether I'd react in front of my family. I told him to let go. He kept holding it for another second before finally releasing me and setting the drill back down on the table. Then he walked down the driveway without another word, got into an older green sedan parked a few houses away, and drove off. My wife immediately started asking who the hell that guy was and whether we should call the police. I honestly didn't know what to say because trying to explain it out loud made it sound less serious than it felt in the moment. Technically, all he'd done was ask weird questions and grab my wrist for a few seconds. After that, the entire mood of the day changed. We moved the tables closer to the street and kept the garage door mostly shut for the rest of the sale. Every time a car slowed down outside, I looked up expecting to see the green sedan again. My son asked me later why the guy looked angry at me, and I realized both kids had been paying attention the entire time. We ended the garage sale early that afternoon and started bringing everything back inside. That night, I kept checking the driveway through the front window without really meaning to. 2 nights later, around 11:30, my wife and I were in the kitchen packing boxes when we heard the side gate open and slam shut. Not loudly, just enough to get our attention. I went to the back door and turned on the outside light, but nobody was there. The gate was closed again, though the latch looked crooked, like someone had lifted it too hard and let it drop. I checked around the backyard with a flashlight for a few minutes before going back inside. But the entire thing bothered me enough that I finally called the police non-emergency line the next morning and reported what had happened at the garage sale. An officer came by later that afternoon to take the report. When I described the guy and mentioned the questions he'd asked about the move, the garage, and whether the house would be empty soon, the officer stopped writing for a second and asked me to repeat everything carefully. The officer eventually told us there had been a few burglaries nearby, involving houses that were either being sold, emptied out, or in the middle of moves. In some cases, strangers had shown up beforehand, pretending to look at garage sales or furniture. I asked him if he thought it was the same guy. He avoided the question and just told us to keep the garage closed, leave lights on at night, and call immediately if we saw the sedan again. A few days later, on our final night in the house before the move, my phone woke me up a little after 3 a.m. with a motion alert from the camera above the garage. I opened the app half asleep and recognized the man standing at the end of our driveway. The image was grainy, but I knew it was him from the jacket and the cap. He wasn't trying to hide from the camera either. He just stood there, facing the house completely still, for almost a full minute. Then another person walked up beside him. The two of them looked toward the garage, then toward the upstairs windows. A few seconds later, they walked out of frame together. I called 911 immediately, but police never found them. The next morning, while we were loading the moving truck, the same officer came back to the house and told us another home a few streets over had been broken into overnight, while the owners were away. Before leaving, he asked me to send him the camera footage again, because they thought the timing might matter. That was the last update we ever got. The first time I understood what was happening next door, it wasn't because I saw anything illegal. It was because a man knocked on my front door at almost 2 in the morning and clearly thought my house belonged to someone else. The neighbor had moved in about 3 weeks earlier. He was probably in his 30s, and at first there was nothing about him that stood out enough to make me suspicious. He kept the lawn short, brought his trash cans in on time, and waved if he saw anyone outside. The house had been empty for a while before he moved in, so most of us were just glad it wasn't sitting there with dead grass and junk mail piling up anymore. The strange part started with the cars. At first it was 1 or 2 a week, always late, usually after midnight, and never the same car twice. They would pull up with their headlights off or dimmed, park near the curb for a few minutes, then leave. Sometimes someone would get out and walk to the side of the house instead of the front door. Other times the driver would stay inside, and the neighbor would come out to the driveway for less than a minute. I noticed because my bedroom window faced the street, and I was a light sleeper back then. I didn't sit there watching him every night. I just kept waking up and seeing different cars in the same spot, like the house had a schedule no one else on the street knew about. For a while, I told myself it wasn't my business. People have weird routines. Some people work nights. Some people have friends who come over late. None of that was enough to make a big deal out of it. A few days later, I was walking back inside after taking the trash cans out when he called me over from his driveway. He was standing near the open garage with a bottle of water in his hand, smiling like he had been meaning to introduce himself for weeks. I remember thinking he seemed normal in a way that almost felt rehearsed. Friendly, but not relaxed. He asked if I lived in the blue house 2 doors down, how long I'd been in the neighborhood, whether people around there were nosy, things like that. Nothing too obvious at first, but after a while, I realized all of his questions were really about the same thing: how much people in the neighborhood noticed. After a few minutes, he mentioned that he sometimes had people stop by late because of side work. He said some neighbors got weird about cars coming and going, but that it was harmless if nobody made it complicated. Then he asked, in this casual way, if I ever wanted to make some extra money helping with simple pickups. He never said what the pickups were. He didn't have to. I told him I wasn't interested and tried to end the conversation without making it awkward. That was when his face changed. Not dramatically. He didn't suddenly become angry or loud. He just stopped smiling, looked past me toward my house, then back at me, and said enough to make the point clear. If I didn't want the money, I should stay out of his business. I didn't know what to say after that, so I just nodded once and walked back toward my house. After that, the cars became harder to ignore. They still came late, but now every time I heard tires outside, I wondered if he knew I was awake. I stopped standing near the window. I stopped leaving my porch light on all night because I didn't want it to seem like I was watching. Even taking the trash out after dark felt different because his garage was always shut, but I could never tell if someone was inside it. A few nights later, I woke up around 1:40 a.m. to the sound of a car door closing. I didn't get up at first. I just lay there listening. Another door closed. Then I heard low voices outside, too quiet to make out. After maybe 30 seconds, the car pulled away. I got out of bed and looked through the side of the blinds. His driveway was empty, but the garage light was on. A shadow moved across the back wall inside. Then the garage door started closing. The next morning, everything looked normal again. That was the worst part about it. In daylight, the whole thing felt stupid. His house looked clean. His lawn looked better than mine. He waved to an older woman walking her dog like any other neighbor would. If I tried to explain what bothered me, it sounded like I was accusing someone of something, just because cars came by at night. So I did nothing. For almost a week, I ignored it as much as I could. I kept my blinds closed, avoided walking past his house, and tried to convince myself the conversation in his driveway had been more uncomfortable than threatening. Then, on a Thursday night, the situation came to my door. It was just before 2 in the morning when someone knocked hard enough to wake me up. Not a polite knock, not someone tapping because they were unsure. It was fast and impatient, like whoever was outside expected the door to open immediately. I stayed in bed at first, thinking I'd dreamed it. Then it happened again. I got up quietly and moved into the hallway without turning on any lights. From there, I could see the front door, but not the person outside. Another knock hit the door, followed by the sound of someone shifting on the porch. I looked through the peephole. There was a man standing there in a gray hoodie, one hand in his pocket, the other holding something small near his waist. He looked nervous, not scared exactly, like he was already late for something. He kept glancing over his shoulder toward the street, then back at my door. For a second, I thought maybe he needed help. Then I saw his car parked at the curb with the lights off, and I recognized it as one of the cars that had been stopping at my neighbor's house. That was when I realized he had the wrong door. I backed away from the peephole and didn't make a sound. The man knocked again, harder this time, and leaned closer to the door, like he was listening for movement inside. My phone was on the kitchen counter, and I remember standing there debating whether reaching for it would make enough noise for him to hear. Before I could move, the knocking stopped. Through the narrow window beside the door, I saw him turn his head toward the street. A second later, he stepped off my porch. I moved just enough to see through the front blinds. My neighbor was standing near the edge of my driveway. I have no idea where he had come from. I hadn't heard a car, footsteps, anything. He was just there, half turned toward the man from the porch. He didn't look at my house at first. He looked at the man, then toward his own driveway, and made a small motion with his hand. The man in the hoodie walked toward him immediately. They didn't argue. They didn't talk in any way I could hear. My neighbor put one hand lightly on the back of the guy's shoulder and guided him across the street toward his house, like he was correcting a mistake before it got worse. The next morning, I found a small folded piece of paper on my porch. Just one line written in block letters. Wrong house. I moved out 3 months later.